This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. We are in week 4 of our What Do We Believe series. This was a series of video lessons that I gave in the middle of the pandemic, or I guess at the very beginning of the pandemic, because it lasted way longer than 2 weeks. I was assigned the position of interim youth director at my church, and we had to meet virtually for several weeks. And so I went over some of the basics of the Christian faith. I started with the gospel in week 1, and then every week since then, I have been breaking down specific terms that Paul used to describe his gospel in the opening passages of Paul's letter to the Romans. And so in this week, we are talking about the resurrection. In my opinion, one of the most important concepts, or maybe the most important concept in the New Testament. So I'm really excited to share this with you guys. Again, like I said, if you're watching this video, I'm pretty sure that this is the apex of me having the worst haircut in the world and the longest beard in the world, because for some reason, even though we were not allowed by law because of our governor to get a haircut, I decided that I was just going to allow my beard to grow out too. It was a really weird time. 2020, like during the middle of the pandemic, during the quarantines, like I wasn't working. I'm not sure why I let my beard get that long. Maybe I just wanted to see what would happen if it did. And I can tell you right now that it's terrible and I don't look good with the beard. But if you want to see me with this awful, like just terrible looking beard, go to YouTube and you can see all of this in the YouTube video. Or maybe you're on YouTube right now watching this video, and in a matter of seconds, you're going to see just how stupid and ridiculous I looked in 2020. So either way, I hope that this lesson on the resurrection is enlightening to you and that you learn something from it. Thank you guys so much for supporting me. I love you guys very much. And I will see you all next Tuesday for a regular episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Hey, everybody. I hope you guys are having a good week. We are in week 4 of our What Do We Believe series, where we're talking about the gospel, the basic beliefs of the church, and the basic beliefs of Christians everywhere. And so we've been taking a look at Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, where the Apostle Paul outlines the gospel, what it means to believe or have faith. Like, what are our basic beliefs as followers of Jesus? So this week, we're going to be talking about probably the most important belief that we have as Christians, and that is the belief in the resurrection of Jesus. And I think it's true that if Jesus isn't raised from the dead, and Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 15, that if Jesus isn't raised from the dead, then our faith is in vain. I think this is the most important belief that we have as Christians. And in fact, when this series is over, I'd kind of like to take a couple of weeks and break down in a little bit more detail what that actually means. But we're going to try to get through it here in just a couple of minutes today. So here's what Paul says about the resurrection. And again, we're taking a look at Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. So Paul has been explaining his gospel. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about how Paul believed that this good news or message about Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament story, that Jesus was the end of the story or the conclusion of the story of the Old Testament. And we looked last week at how Jesus is the promised king, the son of David, the son of God, the one that God promised to David in the Old Testament to be king over the entire world. So that was what Paul meant when he said that Jesus was a descendant or a son of David, that he was the king that was promised to King David, who would have an eternal kingdom and rule over the world forever. And Paul believes that Jesus is literally the king of the world. So this week we're going to take a look at resurrection, and Paul says this in Romans 1 verse 4, that Jesus was declared to be the Son of God, which again, remember Psalm 2 from last week, the Son of God is that title for the king of God's people, that Jesus was declared to be the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead, according to the Spirit of holiness, Jesus Christ, our Lord. So what does Paul mean by resurrection? What's that idea all about? So resurrection is a Jewish idea. There's no other culture in the ancient world that believes in resurrection. And the basic idea behind the belief in resurrection is that in Genesis 1 and 2, God creates a really good world. Human beings mess that world up, and death is a consequence of human rebellion. In the very end, Jews believed God was going to come back and restore the world, and all of those Jews that had been faithful faithful to God, but had died, would be raised from the dead, and they would be able to live forever in God's new restored world. So that's the belief in resurrection, that people are literally physically raised from the dead in order to participate in the world that God has restored or rescued. It's a very, very important belief. Now, there is a scholar that we've talked about before whose name is N.T. Wright, and he's come up at church a couple of times. Dave's talked about him in his sermon. But N.T. Wright's a British scholar, and several years ago, he wrote a very long, like 800-page book on the resurrection called The Resurrection of the Son of God. And I think, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of people that are kind of in my position, this is kind of like the definitive work on the resurrection. This is kind of the best book out there if you want to understand how the resurrection works historically. And this is what some of the things that N.T. Wright says about the resurrection in that book. Number one, he argues for a bodily resurrection, that resurrection doesn't mean going to heaven when you die. Resurrection doesn't mean coming back as a ghost. Resurrection means that you die, you pass through death, and you come out the other side alive in a body, but you never die again, which is exactly what happens to Jesus in the Gospels, or at least in Matthew and Luke and John, that Jesus, he dies, and then he comes back from the dead in a physical body. Okay, so that's what resurrection means to the Jews. It's not going to heaven or doing anything like that. Resurrection is getting a new body. Number two, Jews believe that when the resurrection began, that would mark the period in history where God would do away with sin and death and evil and remake the world to the place that it was in Genesis 1 and 2, a world without sin or death or pain or suffering. And so when Paul says that Jesus was raised from the dead, what he's saying is that God's new world, the recreation or the restoration of the world that God made in Genesis 1 and 2, starts with the resurrection of Jesus. So there's kind of like a turning point. And you'll see if you read the New Testament, a lot of the times the writers of the New Testament refer to the fact that we're living in the last age. And what they mean by that is that it's that final period in human history where God is remaking or restoring his good world. And then Paul says explicitly in Romans 1:4 that it marks Jesus out as the Messiah. And N.T. Wright in his book on the resurrection spends a long time kind of fleshing out that fact, that when God raises Jesus from the dead, remember that Jesus finally says in his last week before he's crucified, he publicly declares that he is the king, he's the Messiah, he's the son of David, and no one believes him and he's crucified. Well, Paul makes the argument in Romans that by raising Jesus from the dead, not only is God beginning his new world, but God is also proving or declaring or demonstrating that Jesus actually was the son of David, the eternal king. And if we want sort of a proof that Jesus is the real king, all we have to do is look to the fact that Jesus was physically raised from the dead. The fourth point that N.T. Wright makes, and this has been made throughout the Christian tradition, is that resurrection is our future hope as Christians, that eventually we too will be raised from the dead like Jesus when God finally comes back and sets this world in the right place, when God finally comes back and restores this creation. And so if you take a look at the book of Revelation, it can be very difficult to understand, but if you look at the last three chapters, Revelation 20 through 22, that's exactly what happens. God comes back with Jesus, finally destroys all of the sin and evil in the world, and then all of those who have been faithful to Jesus are raised from the dead and get to live in this new heavens and new earth that never die and never go away. We actually are given another physical body that doesn't die and is not destroyed. Now, throughout the ages, there have been a lot of people, both Christians and non-Christians, that have challenged the idea that Jesus was actually physically raised from the dead. There's another scholar, an American named Mike Licona, who wrote an equally long book a few years back called The Resurrection of Jesus, and he just looks at the historical evidence for the resurrection. So Mike Licona demonstrates that the best way of reading all of the historical evidence that we have from the first century when all of this stuff happened is to say that one, Jesus, or at least Jesus's followers, thought that he was actually physically raised from the dead, that when they talked about Jesus being raised, they did not mean that he was a ghost or a spirit or a feeling in their heart, but that he was actually physically raised from the dead, and that the resurrection of Jesus is the best fit for all that we have, or for all the evidence that we have in the first century. So in other words, some of the alternatives that have been given, like the church made up the resurrection accounts, or the church believed that Jesus came back to them in a spiritual sense, but wasn't physically raised. All of those ideas from that have been there throughout church history they don't fit the evidence from the first century. And Licona argues that physical resurrection of Jesus is the best way to understand what actually happened in the first century. So that's a lot of very complex ideas in a short amount of time. We are going to have another short series on the resurrection where we can kind of flesh some of those ideas out a little bit more because it's so important. But this week, I want to focus, I want to ask three main questions before we leave. Question number one, the resurrection, as I said before, is the single most important Christian belief. Why do you think the resurrection of Jesus is so important? Now, I make this case all the time. We had Easter last weekend, and although we love in the United States to focus on Christmas, Christmas is not as significant of a holiday in the church calendar as Easter. Easter is the big one, and it focuses on Jesus' resurrection, so why is that the most important belief in the church? Number two, if the resurrection really happens, how does it make our evangelism and our mission as Christians more significant? So if we believe that the resurrection is the beginning of God restoring his world, why is it important for us to talk to other people about Jesus? Why is it important for us to go out there and do things like we do at our food pantry at the Brighton Center where we're serving and taking care of the needs of other people? Why is that significant if the resurrection really happened? And then number three, how does belief in our future resurrection, the fact that someday what happened to Jesus is going to happen to us, how does that give us hope, or how does that help comfort us or help us know that God has an idea of what's going to happen to all of his people in the future? So there's a lot there, and I'm hoping that we can talk about the resurrection a little bit more on Sunday when we do our Zoom hangout. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.